This is No Spin and I'm Nidhi Razdan. So here we are on day 5 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and incredibly, Ukrainian forces have put up a better than expected resistance to the Russians. As the fighting goes on, a rare emergency session of the UN General Assembly is starting in New York. There was a vote on that last night, but India abstained again, reflecting the bind that New Delhi is in. But we'll talk about that a little later. On the ground, Indian students are struggling to get out of the war zone. In many cases, they've been manhandled and pushed around by Ukrainian forces. Some have been lucky to catch the special flights organized by the government of India, but thousands of others are still stuck, saying that they're not able to reach embassy officials for help. The viral videos of students crying out for help seem to have prompted the Prime Minister to hold not one, not two, but 3 meetings on Ukraine in the last 24 hours. He's also ordered 4 ministers to fly to countries bordering Ukraine to help the process. In fact, General V.K. Singh, one of those ministers who's heading out there, has said today that if you're stuck on Mars as well, the Modi government can save you. Imagine that. You can't make that up. One wonders, though, why it was needed to send ministers to this area. The Ministry of External Affairs has evacuated Indian nationals before. In fact, in 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the government of India evacuated more than 170,000 Indians from the Gulf. It was the world's biggest ever evacuation by a civil airliner, Air India. So that pretty much sums up what's been happening today. But the big question is India's balancing act on Russia. Why is India doing it? What exactly is at play here? So once again, India abstained at the United Nations yesterday on calling an emergency meeting on Russia. Now, very simply, India is under pressure from its old friend, Russia, and from new friends in the West, like the United States and European countries. Now, India has stopped short of actually condemning Russian action. The question is, will this position change? Will India be in fact forced to change this position because of world pressure? Now, why is Russia so important to India? Very simply, it's India's biggest supplier of defense weapons. Russia has helped India, for example, with its ballistic missile submarine. India operates more than 270 Sukhoi 30 fighter jets, which are made in Russia. In addition to that, there are 8 Russian-made Kilo-class submarines that are also operated by India. And there is more. More than 1,300 Russian T-90 tanks are part of India's defense systems, as well as the S-400 air defense system. Russia has also been a great friend always. It stood by India at the UN Security Council on all issues that have mattered to New Delhi. And at the same time, India now finds itself getting closer and closer to Western countries, including the United States, whose support it needs in rising tensions with China. India is a key partner of the US, including in defense, trade, technology. India, America, India, Europe, we have huge people-to-people ties. There's a big diaspora, an Indian diaspora in these places. And France, another P5 country at the United Nations, is also an important friend of India at the UN that really has been standing by India on issues that matter. So the question is, how long can New Delhi remain neutral on Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Can it afford to continue to be like this, or will India have to take a different position eventually? Well, our first newsmaker on No Spin tonight is Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament from the Congress Party and former Minister of State for External Affairs, in fact. Shashi Tharoor, great to have you as our first guest on this brand new show. And I'll begin by asking you about your position on India and Russia. In fact, you've taken a stand where you've said that you believe India shouldn't be seen to be on the wrong side of history, a position which your party seems to have distanced itself from today.
Yeah, I'm speaking for myself, Nidhi, and really, let me begin by congratulating you on the new show. It's good to have you back on primetime television. As far as I'm concerned, I really am speaking on the basis of my own experience, my own international service, and my conviction that India has consistently and should consistently stand for certain principles in international relations that apply to all, in all circumstances. And these principles, the respect for sovereignty of states, the inviolability of borders, and the principle that governments should not use force to resolve their political disputes, all of these have been enshrined in documents going back to Nehru's Panchsheel and before. So it's not that I'm saying anything particularly new. It's just that our government appears to have taken a stand which, to my mind, puts us in a somewhat invidious position. We uphold these principles everywhere else. We don't want to uphold them when it involves Russia because of all the factors you so ably summarized. But tomorrow, if, say, the Chinese march across our border, violate our sovereignty, and try and use force to get what they want out of us, don't you think we'll want to have the same principles upheld by the rest of the world?
No,
it seems to me that this kind of inconsistency is not particularly welcome.
I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, but some of the arguments that some other foreign policy watchers have, sort of put forward is that, well, when China did transgress in Ladakh, a lot of these countries really did not speak up for India when they should have. Now, how would you respond to that argument, that ultimately India just needs to look out for its own interests and that there is double speak, especially from Europe on China?
No, but on that particular incident you're referring to, which is what China did in Galwan in June of 2020, unfortunately, our own Prime Minister declared that the Chinese had not encroached upon Indian territory. So it was going to be somewhat difficult to get foreign countries to say something that we were not prepared to say had happened in our own land. So that's why I think that's not a very good example. But if you take 1962, when the Chinese did march into our country, the world, by and large, stood by us and expressed a great deal of support for us on the basis of these self-same principles.
Do you think that India will have to nuance its position on Russia? Look, at the end of the day, if we are so dependent on the Russians for defense weapons, is it really practically possible for India to take a position against Russia?
No, I'm not suggesting that we just take a blunt position against Russia. I'm saying that we point out that Russia is regrettably in violation of these sacred principles, and that while we have a great deal of respect for, and indeed we support, legitimate Russian security concerns being respected by the states in the region, we don't agree with this way of pursuing those legitimate concerns. That's the sort of message that I believe we could have given. And having given that message, if necessary, we could have still abstained. But the fact is that message was not given. Our explanations, including our explanation of vote in the Council, were somewhat wishy-washy. On this question of whether we'll be forced to change our position, and no one can force a sovereign state like India to change its position, but there's no question that there is a great deal of disappointment in a number of Western capitals and in Ukraine itself. We've seen that awful video of the Ukrainian soldiers assaulting Indian students and saying, your country stood with the Russians, why should we look after you, why should we help you? Why should we get that particular reputation? We don't actually owe Russia anything. Every defense purchase we've made from Russia, we're paying for, and we're very often paying top dollar. So that it's also in Russia's interest to make that money off us. And it would be shooting themselves in the foot for them to try and punish us by depriving themselves of one of their most important military markets in the world. So I think that we should understand there's mutual benefit involved for Russia as well as us. And if we have a good friendship, which we do, we should be able to speak frankly to our friends, at the very least in private.
Shashi Tharoor, you've been part of the UN system for decades. Hasn't this entire incident in a way exposed the weaknesses of the UN and what it can really do? And we have a General Assembly that's meeting in a rare emergency session that has started in New York tonight. What are they going to do at the end of the day?
They'll pass a resolution with an overwhelming majority that disagrees with what the Russians are doing. But it won't have any effect in the sense that a Security Council resolution can have an effect. A Security Council resolution has a certain impact because it's the body entrusted with maintaining international peace and security. And in principle, some of the resolutions under Chapter 7 are supposed to be binding. Though obviously, any permanent member will not allow any resolution to pass against its interests. So it was a foregone conclusion that Russia would veto a negative resolution of the Security Council. In the General Assembly, the Russians have no veto. The resolution will demonstrate to the world how isolated Russia is. Apart from us, the Chinese and a couple of other countries, the Russians will find themselves alone because it's very difficult for the rest of the world to condone what is widely seen as a blatant act of aggression, whatever the justification may be. And the justifications being rolled out themselves are not being, frankly, respected very much around the world. I would say that that's all that's going to happen. It will be a piece of paper, it'll be a document, that perhaps can be periodically waved in the faces of the Russians. But it will have no binding effect at all.
Can I get a quick comment from you on the evacuation efforts, the Indian students who are stranded there in Ukraine? General VK Singh says that if you're stuck on Mars, Modi ji will save you. What do you think?
I certainly hope that he does so. I mean, I was a bit dismayed to see the celebratory way in which fewer than 1,000 people who've come back were being greeted with much effusive praise for the government by its own ministers, when in fact we have 20,000 more who are in many cases in rather desperate conditions. Many have run out of food or water. Very few actually have any resources or money. Some are being badly treated at the border crossings they've reached. Some are in places where they can't even get to the border because they're in interior towns and there is no transportation available or the means to access that transportation for them. So there's some real problems that we need to address. I'm not sure that sending ministers is the answer. It shows a certain seriousness of intent, great. But if those ministers end up distracting the staff on the ground because they have to dance attendance on the bigwigs, it'll be a shame, because what's really needed is more junior people at the border crossings in all of these countries and all of these crossings to actually help resolve any misunderstandings.
That's actually a sentiment that a lot of students have echoed as well. I think many are very grateful and thankful that they've been able to get out. But those that are just looking for help just need to speak to an official on the ground to be able to get from point A to point B. Shashi Tharoor, great to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. I'm going to go straight across to our second guest tonight. Syed Akbaruddin was India's ambassador to the United Nations. He's now the Dean of the Kautilya School of Public Policy in Hyderabad. Mr. Akbaruddin, great to have you on the program. Let me begin by asking you, I mean, you've been part of the Ministry of External Affairs for so many decades. The MEA has successfully conducted evacuations of Indian citizens before. Do you really believe we needed to send ministers to now kind of oversee what's going on? Will it help?
So, Nidhi, before I start, I'd like to welcome you back on your perch, and I wish you all the best in NDTV again. That said, you're right. That India has a long tradition of helping its nationals in zones of conflict. I remember as a young diplomat, I was on the border between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia when the invasion of Kuwait took place in 1990. So we have a long tradition. We have a understanding of how to handle these things. That said, it's not new that we have senior level supervision. Let's look at the most recent big crisis we handled in Yemen. General VK Singh was at that time deployed in Djibouti, from where he was overseeing Air India flights into Yemen and back to Djibouti, from where Indians were coming back. So it's a call that the government of the day can decide to have senior level supervision. So I don't think there needs to be too much concern expressed on senior level supervision. If that is what the government of the day wants, I think we need to give them that space to make that. However, we certainly need more people there to help, because zones of conflict are staggering in their vastness, especially and their chaos, absolutely. And therefore, the more people we have on the ground, the better it is. Senior level supervision helps, also signals, and diplomacy is also about signaling. So I think we should leave that aside about whether there needs to be senior level supervision. If the government of the day decides, so be it. It will not impede or infringe on the work which is required at the ground level.
Right. So let me ask you then about India's position and the sort of tightrope that it's walking diplomatically on Russia at the moment. You heard what Shashi Tharoor said just before you came on. He believes that India needs to take a stand based on principles and that we shouldn't be seen to be on the wrong side of history. Do you think we can afford to do that?
So, Nidhi, again, it's useful to go back in history and see what has been India's position. Let's go back in my recollection. If you go back across many prime ministers, many governments, you'll find that the end result is what we've always taken. Let's go back to 1956, the invasion in Hungary. Under Prime Minister Nehru, we did not adopt a condemnatory approach. So that set the bar for us that while we may have a view, we do express support for principles, we do not follow a trajectory of a condemnatory approach. That's not the only instance. I told you in 1956 in Hungary, when the Soviet Union sent troops there. In 1968, in Czechoslovakia, when Mrs. Gandhi was the Prime Minister, again, we did not follow a condemnatory approach. In 1979, in Afghanistan. And I heard Mr. Shashi Tharoor, but he, I think, may have forgotten that in 2008, when there was this dispute between Russia and Georgia about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, again, India did follow a non-condemnatory approach and abstained on the vote.
But Ambassador, sorry to interrupt, but foreign policy does evolve as well, and I would assume that India has evolved. Certainly, in all these decades, we now see ourselves as a rising superpower. We are part, of a tie-up known as the Quad with supposedly like-minded democracies, including the United States. So when we set to tell the world that we are the world's largest democracy, and we want to set an example by saying that, then isn't it awkward for India when you see such a naked aggression as you do by President Putin to sit on the fence? I know that India's position has been a bit more nuanced. In fact, we've offered humanitarian aid to the Ukraine as well today. But given what we are propagating to the world as a democracy, how long can we sit on the fence?
So, Nidhi, I take your point. But let's look at the other side of this. I think we made 6 statements in the Security Council itself over the last month, or a little less than, yes, a month. 31st of January it started, and till today we made 6 statements. Look at how we've evolved. You're looking at the big issue of whether we've abstained or not. First of all, let's start with the big picture. Abstention is not support for Russia. If that was so, then Russia, it would be counted as a negative vote. Let's be clear. Abstention differs from voting no. And you can see the difference in what Russia was doing and what we were doing. But that's the big picture. Leave that aside. Look at the granular detail. In the first 3 statements that we made, we did not refer to any principles except expressing our hope for a diplomatic
I have 30 seconds.
Solution.
Right.
But in the last 2, we made 5 different changes, and that's clearly an evolution. We are now repeatedly saying that territorial integrity and sovereignty is a principle that is of abiding interest and faith to all of us.
Well,
we are also saying...
No, sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you because I'm out of time. I see what you're saying. It is a dilemma. Clearly, India does have to look out for its own interests, but at the same time, when we abstained, we were in the company of China, ironically, and the UAE. Is that the company we want to be in on such important moral issues as well? So that's just something to think about. At the end of the day, diplomats know best about what position India should take. Thank you very much, Ambassador Akbaruddin. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidhi.
Well, in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia is facing unprecedented sanctions at the moment, sanctions that have been imposed on it by the United States and the European Union, among others. Joining us exclusively on NDTV today is Ambassador Hugo Astuto, the European Union's envoy to India. Ambassador, thank you very much for speaking to us today. May I ask you first, what are, in your view, the impact of these sanctions announced so far actually going to be on the ground? There is, of course, the cutting off Russia's key banks from the central banking system, the SWIFT banking system. Airspace has been closed over the EU for Russian planes, etc. But on the ground, how much do you think that this would work against Russia?
Thank you. Well, this package of sanctions is massive. It is somewhat unprecedented. It's meant to have a severe impact on India, on the economy of Russia, and it is meant to affect severely those responsible for this unprovoked and unjustified attack. You may have heard a third package of sanctions has been approved yesterday night, including 500 million euros in arms, lethal and non-lethal weapons. And let me underscore here, as this is a first, the European Union had never done it. It's a measure which reflects the gravity of the situation, the seriousness of the attack. It's an aggression against Ukraine. It's also a blatant violation of the UN Charter. I think it's important to underscore here that we have an unprovoked and an unjustified aggression from Russia, and it cannot go unanswered.
Ambassador, there are, however, some conflicting views on how much Russia would actually be crippled by these sanctions. Russia says it has billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in forex reserves. At the same time, experts point out that Russia's economy is not in the poor state that it was in when it annexed Crimea all those years ago. Therefore, how would you look at these comments that perhaps Russia might be able to withstand these sanctions at the end of the day?
Well, when it comes to the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank, you will have noted that actually parts of the sanctions which are foreseen are also meant precisely to make it impossible the use of these reserves. I definitely believe that the package of sanctions is such that its effect will not go unnoticed. I think the impact will be severe.
Right. Can I ask you then, Ambassador, as you said, the European Union is in fact now even going to help finance giving weapons to Ukraine, which is unprecedented. What next can we expect in terms of further sanctions against Russia? Is there scope to do more?
Well, you will have seen that these successive packages of sanctions have been following developments on the ground. The severity of the aggression has been matched by the gravity of the sanctions. I think there may be scope for more. It all depends on how the situation evolves. You have also heard about a number of European Union member states closing their airspace to Russian aircrafts. There is something that now the European Union is also willing to further expand to a new wide prohibition.
But can you give us an example of what that could possibly be? What more in terms of sanctions?
No, I think we'll wait and see. What I would like to underscore here is the extreme how reactive European institutions and European member states have been, how fast the reaction has come. What I can tell you is that if the same level of aggression continues, we will react with equal rapidity and efficiency.
Ambassador, you would have seen that India is sort of walking a fine diplomatic tightrope when it comes to this matter, given its relations with Russia on one hand and now with the United States and other European countries on the other hand. How do you view India's position on this? It has abstained again on the calling of an emergency session of the UN General Assembly.
Well, what I can tell you is that we keep discussing the situation with our friends and partners, with the Indian authorities. We keep them appraised of our assessment and of our perspective. We believe that we are facing a defining moment in the history of Europe. And this is a moment whose consequences may well go beyond the current geographical scope, in the sense that violations of the UN Charter, violations of international law, efforts to disrupt permanently the rules-based system of international governance. Well, all these risks setting a precedent, which is extremely risky for the whole of the international community. So what we are trying to do is to foster a unified response of the international community, and conversations are now ongoing in New York for a resolution to be tabled at the UN General Assembly.
So given what you've just said, do you think that India needs to be more categorical in its condemnation of the Russian invasion? Do you think India would have to take a firmer stand?
No, I will simply repeat what I said earlier. I think it's important that the international community assesses the situation for its actual gravity. We clearly see a violation of the UN Charter. And the UN Secretary General said so a couple of days ago.
But do you think, as the world's largest democracy, that a special responsibility falls on India to take a position?
Again, I would say that the rules-based system of international governance is a global common good, and we all need to work together to preserve it.
Well, Ambassador, that is why you are a good diplomat. Thank you very much for joining us on NDTV today. Thank you very much.